In the early days of January 1943, I appeared in Saarburg, Lorraine, where the reserve battalion of my regiment was stationed. As I passed through the massive stone and iron gates, the sentry at the gate perked up and gave me his hand. Having just been promoted to lieutenant, I was somewhat embarrassed by this greeting and hastily responded to it before I suddenly stopped and gazed at the sentry. On getting a better look at him, I realized that he was my old friend Obulus Meissner of the 14th Company. It was still a tradition in the German army for young lieutenants to salute the soldier who first saluted him after his promotion, and we arranged to meet at a local beer hall to talk about recent and past affairs. After checking in with the garrison command, I saw out some comrades from the 14th Company. To my surprise, there was Joseph Vogt, Sepp Clemens, Field Officer Weiss, and Lieutenant Huber. Also here was my old enlisted Fleur Jacob Gonadel. All friends were together because of wounds received at the front and had come to the reserve battalion from various military hospitals in the area. We were handed out the inevitable assignments and training plans. On the second day, the schedule called for organizing a circular defense for an anti-tank position, including the creation of tank traps and ditches. As the officer in charge of this exercise, I asked for the necessary shovels and picks from the warehouse and learned that there were no tools available. Even the most basic things were lacking. To fulfill the task, we searched and found in the basement of the garrison administration, building a huge secret warehouse with new, unused tools hanging in rows on the wall. Now, prepared to conduct a training exercise, we confidently took up the tools and, dressed in our combat uniforms, marched in formation to the training area nearby. On my return that evening, I received orders to report immediately to the unit headquarters. There I introduced myself to some burly Tylovic officer, whom I found sitting behind a massive desk piled with documents. I was forced to listen to a ridiculous tirade about the use without permission of tools, saved strictly for air defense. Pointing a fat finger in the air to emphasize each word, he lectured me on the importance of the tools and stated categorically that under all circumstances said equipment should remain in the basement in anticipation of the inevitable air raid on our garrison. The picks and shovels were returned to the cellar to hang uselessly on the wall. Perhaps they hang in the cold rooms of this French garrison to this day, slowly rusting away, still performing the functions for which they were obtained by the Wehrmacht. Having served so many months at the front among friends and comrades, I was no longer surprised that my days in the reserves were less pleasant. This may have been due in part to my break with peacetime army traditions, expressed in socializing with my former soldier friends. Together with two other recently promoted lieutenants, Horst Leinhardt and Hans Dermayer, I invited some colleagues from the old group in the 14th Company to the former home of a French officer for an evening of drinking and singing. Inevitably, the evening's conversation touched on other friends left behind on the Eastern Front in our old regiment. We all felt a sense of alienation in that rear area. It was no longer our army, our environment. Immediately after receiving my rank, I wrote a letter to my former regimental commander asking to be allowed to return to the 437th Regiment. And in the middle of January 1943, the order came to report to my old regiment. Together with Horst Leinhardt, I went in a crowded train with vacationers returning to the front, through Dresden, Königsberg, Kovno, Pleska, and on to Tosno. While the last remnants of von Paulus's Sixth Army were suffering the blows of fate in Stalingrad, another theater of war became a priority and began to attract all attention because of its political importance. For the communist state, both Stalingrad and Leningrad embodied in their names a great political, economic, and spiritual significance. These cities were given their names by Lenin, the father and spiritual leader of the revolution in Russia, and by Stalin, the iron ruler who ruled the Soviet Union with whip and gun like a red Tsar. The seizure of these vast, densely populated territories therefore had a significance far beyond mere strategic necessity. Rather, they became a symbol of resistance, which our invading armies needed to defeat, regardless of any losses. Leningrad had remained surrounded by German troops since the fall of 1941. On September 24 of that year, Hitler withdrew the tank corps and infantry formations that were in reserve for the final assault on the city. After that, plans for a successful attack simply evaporated, and never again could troops be assembled in such numbers and with such power for a final assault on the weakened and unprepared enemy holding the city. The crucial error in delaying the offensive on the city was epitomized in the 900-day Battle of Leningrad that followed, the battles south of Lake Ladoga and on the Volkhov front, in which our division participated from September 1942 to November 1943, led only to the depletion of badly needed resources, from which the Wehrmacht never recovered. On land, Leningrad was completely cut off only during the summer months. Since the city was located on the western shore of Lake Ladoga, numerous boats could deliver limited supplies to the besieged city. From the western shore of the lake to the eastern shore, also in the hands of the Soviets, only 30 kilometers, which is about the same distance as the width of the English Channel near Calais. This lake remained a gap in which all our efforts to organize a blockade were wasted. The German 18th Army held a 14-kilometer corridor along the southern shore. The cornerstones on which our flanks were held were the towns of Schlüsselburg and Lipka. This narrow, dangerous corridor, nicknamed Bottle Neck, stretched along the Siniewinsky Heights and was bordered by impassable swamps. The entire southern part of the front was located along the Neva, and the besieged Soviets made repeated attempts to break through this ring that blocked their city, and therefore constantly put pressure on our eastern front. At the southern end of this throat ran the Kirov Railroad, which connected Leningrad with the Urals. Leningrad was dying. Soldiers and civilians, women, old men, and children were dying from the starvation that our encirclement brought them. Those who did not build fortifications and did not work at the factory did not receive food rations. Those who were entitled to a daily ration received 2 pieces of bread a day. Everything that could burn was used to heat homes and workplaces. Everything edible disappeared. Even wallpaper was torn off the walls and boiled to extract the meager amount of food from the paper and glue. Zhidanov, the military and political commander of Leningrad, mercilessly hounded the population in his tireless efforts to save his city and country. Women, old men, and teenagers were forced to work in shifts digging anti-tank ditches. Those who could not work were automatically doomed to die of starvation. All available food was needed by those who were able to help in the defense of the city. By incredible efforts, the production of weapons and war materials continued. Tanks were coming off the conveyor belt almost in full view of the German troops who remained in their positions on the very outskirts of the city. German strategists clearly underestimated the winter peculiarities of Lake Ladoga. The huge body of water was freezing at a distance of more than 30 kilometers. Contrary to predictions, a road on the ice blanket 1 to 1.5 meters thick, the road of life for Leningrad, was successfully built. All through the long winter, heavy trucks rolled into the city in the dark hours, delivering the most necessary war materials. Food was in the very last place in terms of importance. Gasoline was almost gone. Then Zhdanov, under cover of darkness, laid a railroad across the ice. After the thaw, the Soviets laid a pipeline across the seabed to deliver fuel and electricity. Electricity from the Volkhov station on the Svir River was supplied to the military factories, which never stopped producing. In September 1942, our 132nd Division played a major role in the breakthrough to Gatilov during the first battle south of Lake Ladoga. The offensive, in which the Soviets attempted to break through to Emga in order to liberate Leningrad by land, turned into a disastrous defeat for the Red Army. The second major battle south of Lake Ladoga began on January 12, 1943, when our division was located further south in the Sak, near Pogosty and Volkhov. This time, the fighting reached us on February 11. The city on the Neva, the cultural pearl of Russia, The city that until the revolution bore the name Petersburg in honor of the greatest Tsar was destined to free itself from the German clutches with the help of a tremendous double sweep carried out by the Red Army. For over 2.5 years, the city of 3 million inhabitants, Russia's second largest, withstood the ring of German troops on the northern flank of the Eastern Front. Like Stalingrad, the city, which bore the name of one of the founders of Bolshevism, was of paramount political importance and had to be liberated. In February 1943, the Soviets managed to break through our front and create the threat of encirclement for the German troops in the Iranian bomb cauldron. Faced with this danger, the soldiers of the 132nd Infantry Division defended their positions with the most stubborn resistance and thus averted a catastrophe the size of which could have been compared to the Stalingrad defeat. When I returned to my old regiment, many of my old comrades were gone, but I soon felt at home again. I was immediately sent for 2 weeks to the Volkhov front as a platoon commander, and in this sector of the front the activity of the Soviet troops was increasing. The climatic and combat conditions in which we were in the area south of Leningrad were much different from those to which the military units from the Crimea were accustomed. The terrain was swampy, abundant with dense undergrowth and birch trees, interspersed with low hills on which it was possible to organize a focal defense system. When the weather warmed up, water began to seep from everywhere, which made it impossible to go deep into the ground to make shelters. Instead of trenches, our defensive line was composed mainly of barricades made of roughly hewn logs, which were covered with earth and branches. These positions could be compared to the primitive palisades once built by the Roman legions. In order to supply the various sections of the front, a narrow-gauge railroad was laid across the swamp, and the Klosterdorf and Wasserkopf positions were made accessible by tracks through the marshes made of logs cut in these dense forests. These narrow but efficient routes were used for supplying troops by horse-drawn carts, and in the darkness of night, one could hear the animals tearing as they dragged their loads over the crackling logs. The cart frames were modified and axles, and rims removed from defunct military vehicles were attached, and the result was a miniature railroad. Encouraged by victories at Stalingrad and on the southern flank of the Eastern Front, the Russians made strenuous efforts to organize an offensive in the north. In the harsh winter months, their armored units could move through frozen swamps, and prevented them only thick trunks of birch trees, preventing them from deploying tank attacks on a large scale. When the bitter cold came upon us, the Russians rushed to attack directly on Smerdina. This second battle south of Lake Ladoga began in January. The 437th Infantry Regiment was assigned to the XXX Army Corps on the Volkhov front to reinforce the defending divisions. After the situation in this sector stabilized again, the regiment was returned to the division, where it took up positions on the right flank of the division in the sector assigned to Weber's battle group. The division had the task of defending the barely held sector, stretching 40 kilometers along the front. At the end of January, the enemy forces in the area of the Sac near Pogosty became more active. Numerous reconnaissance groups and raids by forces of up to 1 company indicated that the pressure was being applied in coordination with the fighting being conducted by Soviet troops south of Lake Ladoga. Because of poor visibility, no aerial reconnaissance was conducted until February 9, and after that there were reports of large concentrations of enemy troops moving along the roads in the Sac of Pogostya. During the night, numerous campfire fires were seen in the Senin area. Changes in the enemy soldiers themselves became more apparent, as many sections of the front were reinforced in large numbers by fresh troops equipped in new camouflage uniforms to match the color of the snow and armed with recently issued assault rifles with round discs. The division confirmed that the enemy sector opposing us was being replaced and that new attacks were to be expected in the next day or two. And the attack took place on February 11. In the sector of the 436th Regiment on the front line, exhausted units came under attack by a detachment consisting of 10 tanks accompanied by infantry. The battle-worn, tired regiment was unable to hold the front under the concentrated tank attack, and the enemy managed to break through. The enemy troops continued this offensive, and the next day, having received fresh reinforcements during the night, they penetrated into the area southwest of Klosterdorf, eliminating all possibilities for a quick counterattack. Battle-weary troops occupying the defense managed at the cost of inhuman efforts to stop the breakthrough at Klosterdorf. However, this ledge until February 13 was held by the enemy. In the next 2 days, the enemy cut the road to Klosterdorf and strengthened the newly won positions. The Russians attacked the positions of the 6th Battery of the 132nd Artillery Regiment with tanks, and our troops were forced to destroy their guns before withdrawing from their positions. The guns fell into enemy hands, and although the barrels were damaged, so that the enemy could not use them, it was an irretrievable loss for the division and the regiment, and it was the first time in the whole war when the division left heavy guns to the enemy, even temporarily. On February 16 and 17, all efforts to close the gap in the defense proved futile. Attempts by battalions on the southern and western flanks to break through the Soviet defenses were unsuccessful, as the enemy had now reinforced the defenses with tanks, which were positioned along the road. Until February 18, the Russians successfully repelled all attacks, but then units of the 96th Infantry Division managed to clear this road. Supported by units of the 132nd Division, they were able to retake the artillery positions with the now useless guns still in place. The hot breath of battle was descending, bearing its retribution on those who were exhausted in the forests, swamps, and groves between the Volkhov and Lake Ladoga. With the first morning rays penetrating through the snow, the god of war arose, and another day of death began. The slumbering marshes awoke from their frosty slumber to burst into life, and as the day before, the rumble of battle reigned over all that white void. Like a cloud spewing fire and steel, the morning mist rose and scattered its seeds of death. For nearly 2 weeks, the specter of death stole across the snow-covered marshes. Each sunrise brought with it an intense artillery barrage that rained down on the German positions. Marking the beginning of the day, mortars, heavy guns, and anti-tank guns fired continuously. When the shell bursts ceased, the soldiers crawled back to their trenches to meet the brown, earth-colored waves of infantry that emerged from the thickets, accompanied by tanks that crushed the evergreen pines and alders with their wide tracks. The Soviets' superior forces allowed them to break through several weakened sections of the defenses and break through the main front. A fierce battle raged for this transportation artery. The enemy's aim was to bypass the isolated groups of defenders and strike deep into the territory. But the determination of the German grenadiers, who fought to the last bullet, enabled them to hold out. The Russian attack became bogged down in the dense undergrowth on the marsh. Black-brown craters stood out in the snow. Broken branches and stumps obstructed all movement. It was impossible to know where to place our heavy weapons to support the infantry. The interspersed ice sinks, mud, and dense forests made it impossible to figure out where to set up defenses before the enemy attacked again. During the night, the Soviets again managed to break through our sector and even penetrated through this wilderness to the road. But here they were stopped by a well-camouflaged ATT battery. On the snow were clearly distinguished dirty brown craters from artillery shells. Trees in the dense forest were broken and lost their green needles. Fallen pine trees hindered advancement through the swampy terrain. So where to advance the heavy infantry weapons? From where could a counterattack be launched? Once again, the enemy tanks broke through our defenses, seeking to strike at the positions of our artillery. 4 huge steel machines were left to burn. The rest withdrew under the protection of the Soviet trenches. After this unsuccessful attempt, they no longer moved along the narrow road, but preferred to fight their way through the wilderness rather than take the risk of being destroyed in the open. Our anti-tank units responded accordingly. Calculators dismantled the guns, dragged them across the swamps on the backs of soldiers and horses, and placed them in the path of the most likely attacks. Often falling waist-deep in icy water and snowdrifts, the infantrymen went deep into the forest to meet and repel the enemy. Every step was given with difficulty. Every meter of ground sucked the energy out of the soldiers. Simple rest became a luxury. Sleep was possible only during the lulls between Soviet attacks. Every other day, the enemy threw fresh forces into the attack. They seemed like an endless stream. The dazed grenadiers staggered to their feet, gathered together in a hedgehog-like heap, and waited until the last second to return fire. On their aching bodies, their dirty gray camouflage suits hung like soggy cardboard, thawing only during the day, only to harden again with the frost of night. Between skirmishes, exhausted soldiers lay down in the snow, huddled against the soggy ground with their dried, colorless faces and inflamed eyes. The dark swamp water seeped through their threadbare uniforms and iced their skin. With the appearance of the moon, the frost returned. Day after day, the situation did not change. No sleep, no dugout or shelter, no luxury of a simple fire to warm frostbitten limbs. Muscles stiffened and unresponsive. Legs ached. In between fights, arms dangled limply at their sides. And once again, the order came that roused us to our feet. Leaping out of our holes after hours of squatting in the snow, we tore through the semi-darkness in response to the order to attack. Flying in waves forward, we were seized with the urge to kill the enemy wherever he was, to kill as many of the soldiers clad in round white helmets as possible, to destroy as many as possible of those enemies who hourly threatened to strike us and take our own lives. With this counterattack, we found new life, until our advance, like the enemy's, came to a halt deep in the forest. With every step, we had to overcome snow and mud. In the impenetrable frozen thickets, free swift blows, which resulted in an opportunity to grab the enemy by the throat, were impossible. We were thrust into a hell from which there was no turning back. To surrender meant immediate death. To survive was simply to delay the inevitable. Our mangled world became surreal and unclear. The looming undergrowth, those snowdrifts and split tree trunks, silently held the secrets they witnessed. Whenever the Bolshevik frenzy crashes upon our defenses, the attack is smothered, coming upon the nameless ranks of the grenadiers. The front continues to stand. Soviet attacks repeatedly break through the exhausted, frozen, and exsanguinated ranks of soldiers from East Prussia, Westphalia, Bavaria, and the Rhineland. When one of the Soviet attacks, supported by tanks, broke through the positions near the forest, and the enemy rushed toward the battalion headquarters, a Prussian field officer attempted to drag an anti-tank gun toward the defenders' trenches, but was unable to mount the gun because of thick limbs and stumps. Pursued by Soviet machine gun fire, he waded through the deep snow to the neighboring gun, whose crew had been killed moments before. The Feldfebel had never touched such a weapon, and 2 grenadiers rushed to his aid. Quickly setting his sights, he fired. After all, it should work, and it did work. The first tank rose sharply and burst into flames, followed shortly by the second, and for a short time the Soviet attack stalled. Now the Soviet chains had almost completely surrounded the weakened and exhausted German battalion, which was, like an island, deep in the enemy rear. The battalion successfully repulsed the onslaught of the attacking Russians and managed to hold the supply road. The blackened hulks of battered enemy tanks along the perimeter of the defense were a mute testimony to the heavy fighting that took place within the narrow confines of this sector. One night, the assault team was successful in destroying 4 enemy dugouts and 1 enemy anti-tank position, but was cut off and dispersed in the ensuing firefight. After 9 days and nights behind enemy trenches, without rest under a mercilessly frosty sky, 2 battle-weary Afridiers reached our trenches at dawn, carrying a wounded comrade. They wrapped him in a cloak tent, and slipping a pole through the tied ends, carried him alone, moving among the enemy in the hours of darkness and hiding behind snowdrifts during the day. On reaching their own, they collapsed from fatigue, and it took several hours for them to regain consciousness. Refusing an offer to ferry them to the rear to rest, they rose and wandered back to their company's position. The next night, their company attacked and captured an enemy stronghold with the 2 men in their ranks, destroying the last enemy bastion in their sector. Weeks of fighting in the swamps north of Smerdini had consumed the last reserves of strength and spirit. The time-consuming, leisurely forest warfare translated into continuous fighting against a vastly superior enemy whose forces were endless. Grenadiers, artillerymen, sappers, and anti-aircraft gunners had to pay a heavy tribute for endeavoring to endure the worst possible conditions of ruthless nature. The main front line continued to stretch along a ledge in the defenses held by our regiment. The 7th Company was placed on the left flank, stretching north-south within the narrow depression of the Lesna River. Then a fragile line curved to the right, facing southward with the front toward the edge of the woods. Then this line disappeared into the dense forest, going a few hundred meters in a straight line, and then turning to the right again with a front to the west and southwest. Inside this stretched ledge, about 30 meters behind the trenches, was the company headquarters, consisting merely of a hut surrounded by a trench, covered with earth and snow. 2 nights ago, an adjustment had been made in the line of defense, with the result that the right flank had been pulled back, thus shortening the line and reducing the growing threat of encirclement and annihilation. Between the trenches was no man's land with thick thickets and coniferous trees. On February 15, calm reigned along the front line. With the onset of this quiet restlessness gripped the platoons holding the squishy front. Rarely could one hear only the fateful whisper of the winter wind whipping through the treetops. This front almost always gave off signs of life, whether it was the occasional crack of a sniper's rifle or the methodical shot of Maxim machine guns probing our defenses. The day before, the Soviets had conducted a battle reconnaissance of the entire length of the ledge. Wherever they appeared, only ghostly silhouettes were visible through dense thicket and deep snow at a distance of, at best, less than 50 meters. They were either destroyed or thrown back. In spite of the outward absence of the enemy, it could be felt that the Soviets were closing in on us. Our bulge was strengthened at the expense of our left and right flanks. 2 heavy machine guns were mounted and carefully camouflaged in the defense line, the sector where this line extended beyond the trenches. Turning sharply to the right, was reinforced during the night, for which purpose we cut down trees and stacked heavy logs in front of the trenches. At this point I ordered a heavy machine gun to be placed at the bend of the line, as the maximum sector of fire could be secured here, while the squad under the command of an Oberfreier placed a light machine gun in the center sector. The grenadiers, 2 soldiers shivering with cold, entrenched themselves by occupying snow holes 15 meters apart. After a day of hard work in the snow, the night was brutally frosty. Their feet stiff in their frozen boots, the grenadiers grew increasingly numb with cold and exhaustion. Crammed into the desiccated and frozen confines of the primitive earthen fortifications, their occupants were generally unprotected from the cold that reigned in the snowy dens to torment them. Suddenly, a heavy MG machine gun tore the silence with an eardrum-shattering rumble, followed by a shout. "Alert! Ivan!" The corporal pressed the trigger of the MG-42, firing rapid, short bursts into the dusk, and was joined by the heavy MG at the edge of the forest. The crackle of rifle shots could be heard between the MG bursts. In response came the soft drumbeat of Soviet Maxim rifles, joined by the piercing shots of the ubiquitous Soviet machine guns. Bullets whistled in the pine needles, dropping snow-laden branches to the ground and boring long furrows in the snow piled in front of the defenders' trenches. A field felon at the heavy MG was lying down beside the machine gun, holding his rifle, working the bolt rapidly, and sending one clip after another. The forest was swarming with Bolsheviks. At first we noticed them 30 meters in front of our positions, from which we could hear through the undergrowth the crackling of branches and the crunch of ice under the feet of dozens, perhaps hundreds of heavy Russian boots. Machine guns rumbled, joined by machine guns and rifles, muffled by the crack of gunfire and the bursting of grenades. In short intervals from the din of machine gun fire could be heard the shouts of "Hurrah! Hurrah!" And after a few seconds of firing, these shouts were replaced by groans as the dead, wounded, and dying fell in the snow in front of our trenches. Mountains of bodies clad in light brown and white camouflage uniforms were piled up in front of our machine gun positions, and new Russians were filling the gaps that our hot barrels had torn in the attacking masses. The forest in front of us had become a firing range full of targets. There was no need to scout out targets, for the Russians were throwing themselves at our trenches. Jumping, dodging, shooting, shouting, they rushed forward. Despite the boundless terror that seized them, the grenadiers remained in their positions, not giving in to panic. Like a training ground, the soldiers kept up the pace of fire, being able to see the sector of fire directly in front of them, but not knowing what was happening to their right or left. A few rifles fell silent. The situation became even more dangerous when the Soviet attack was smothered only 6 meters from the barrels of our machine guns. For about an hour the rumble of battle echoed in the woods. Seeing no end to the waves of attackers, in desperation I ordered our last reserve, a small detachment of 4 men, to prepare for battle. At that moment, a request for help came to me from a platoon on my left flank. Its position was in danger of imminent collapse, although the light machine gun continued to fire continuously in long, sharp bursts, accompanied by endless bursts of grenades which the desperate grenadiers hurled at the attackers. The dead and wounded filled the woods. Our own losses remained relatively light, 2 killed and 3 wounded. Our losses were light compared to what we inflicted on the enemy, but were nonetheless irreplaceable. The firing on our right flank waned and finally subsided as the Soviet attack stalled. The defenders, 4 or 5 tired grenadiers, remained alert, keeping their fingers on the triggers of their weapons, which were slowly cooling in the frosty air. Suddenly there was a movement among the Russians. Some exceptionally tall Russian rose out of the snow-covered forest at a distance of 30 meters, shouted an unintelligible command, and waved his raised hand to the left. A new wave of attackers came from the direction indicated. Rows of the advancing Russians scattered under heavy machine gun fire, their bodies falling to the ground, and among them, a tall Russian. The attack was finally thwarted. The Bolsheviks stuck to their positions and began to fire from snowholes, from behind cut branches and torn stumps, from hidden positions in the woods. Gradually their fire began to weaken, giving way in the air to the groans of their wounded, who screamed and thrashed in agony in front of our trenches. For more than 2 hours they rushed upon the weak position defended by grenadiers from East Prussia, Rhineland, Bavaria, Palatinate, Baden, and Württemberg. I noticed that the heavy machine gun had fallen silent, and that the rifle fire had slowly subsided. In the machine gun nest, the calculation lay stretched out beside their weapons. The corporal lay as if asleep behind his smoking weapon, the curved butt of the machine gun still pressed firmly against his shoulder. His head leaned forward. The heavy snow-white helmet remained leaned against the smoking feeding chute of the machine gun, where the cartridges entered the chamber. He was last in his reckoning. Slowly the moans of the wounded fell silent, and the silence was interrupted only by muffled noises. The Russians were trying to crawl back to their trenches. The snow began to fall, and I was surprised to notice that it was already afternoon. During the attack, the forest around us took on a different appearance. Entire trees had been mowed down by small arms fire. The ground had been dug up and mangled by craters. Branches and limbs dangled from mangled stumps. The evergreen trees in the line of fire were without needles and looked like bare poles protruding from under the snow. The only color that caught our eye against the background of this frozen desert was the scarlet blood that covered the dead and dying who lay in front of our guns and machine guns. The Soviets began firing mortars. Muffled bursts echoed in the woods. Their attack was repulsed only moments before our positions would have collapsed under the pressure of the waves of attackers. In those final minutes they would break through our defenses, but the fact was that their forces were also depleted. The distance of about 80 meters of our defense was held only by the dense forest. From its depths, rifle fire could no longer be heard. We repulsed an attack by a Soviet battalion, from which few returned to their trenches. Then, at the risk of falling victim to a sniper, we surveyed the small interval in front of our line of defense to assess the consequences of the massacre, while the grenadiers counted the dead. More than 160 corpses lay in front of our trenches. Most lay in front of a heavy machine gun set up in an earthen fortification on the edge of the woods, and were also scattered in front of the machine gun behind which the senior non-commissioned officer was stationed. Lying in the snow was also found the tall Russian who had led this last fatal attack. He had a Cossack dagger stuck in his belt, which had probably been with the soldier through many past battles. The dagger showed a thin layer of rust, and the blade and scabbard were sticky with fresh blood. There were 12 notches on the handle, the significance of which was obvious. Tank on the right, tank in front, tank on the left. From all three directions, Soviet tanks, mostly T-34s, were trying to crush the division's defenses. Disregarding how many of the steel giants had already exploded and burned under the deadly fire of our camouflaged anti-tank guns, always more of them rolled forward to replace the out-of-service vehicles. The front was interrupted as it passed through the dense forests between Klosterdorf and Smerdinja. The rumble of battle rose to a crescendo. A small fighting group from Drexel's Grenadier Regiment continued to hold out between tree stumps, curled up in snow bowls behind hastily constructed log barricades. It was supported by the ATT of Oberfruder Kurmayer of the 14th Anti-Tank Company, 436th Grenadier Regiment, one of the regimental veterans. Through the din of battle, his experienced ear picked up the sound of tank shots coming from the right. From their position, all they could see was an impassable maze of stumps, piles of frozen logs, and a tangle of branches and roots that, when confronted, would choke any attack. The farmer's son from Lower Bavaria continued to wait with the patience of a hunter, gazing into the forest with a lynx's eye from behind the steel shield of his anti-tank gun. He was joined by other soldiers from the regiment, and they stood motionless in the snow, trying to penetrate this frozen jumble with their gaze. Finally, the location of the looming Soviet troops gave away the movement of a steel colossus breaking through the trees. Kiermaier gestured for the others to cease firing to give the enemy a chance to get closer while the approaching ranks of attackers unknowingly entered the firing zone. Behind the first tank, the Germans saw a second, then a third, then a fourth, accompanied by the ranks of Russian infantry, which, like ghosts, crept between the trees. Kiermaier remained motionless in his position behind the gun shield, nestled against the rubber eyepiece of his scope. He pointed the crosshairs at the last tank and firmly pressed the trigger. A shell burst out of the gun barrel, struck the tank, and scattered fire and reddened steel inside the turret. When fuel and shells began to explode with a rumble, a thick column of smoke rose from the burning tank. The steel hull effectively blocked the escape route for the front tanks, at the same time showering the surrounding forest with shrapnel and burning fuel. Kiermaier had already shifted his sights to the next target, and after 2 more shots the second tank burst into flames. The other tanks opened fire with guns and machine guns, blindly firing into the dense undergrowth, unable to find the source of enemy fire. The third and fourth tanks began to burn and explode. One more shot from the hidden ATGM destroyed the track of the fifth tank, and its crew left the vehicle, and avoiding small arms fire, fled to the rear together with the retreating infantry. This gun crew then destroyed 3 more tanks, a total of 8 in one day. When the regimental commander received a report on the destruction of the tanks and the repulsion of the enemy attack, he presented the gun commander for the award of the Knight's Cross. Unfortunately, at that time, only 1 Knight's Cross was allowed to be awarded to a battle group, and the award was given to some general fighting north of Smerdini under General Lindemann. Kiermaier was later awarded the Iron Cross for destroying tanks, which aided in repulsing an enemy attack. On February 20, the 405th and 408th Infantry Regiments attacked the enemy from the north, with the intention of cutting off his units that had broken through the gates. In the course of heavy fighting, which cost us heavy losses, in the evening the regiments managed to patch the gap in the defense and to deal with the pockets of resistance of the Russians. From point 38.9 to Klosterdorf the way was free, but our troops no longer had sufficient forces to cut off and eliminate another Russian breakthrough. During 10 days of brutal fighting, The enemy suffered such serious losses that an offensive was undertaken to the north in the direction of Smrdini, and this successful attack allowed us to stabilize the line of defense and rather shattered divisions removed from the front. On February 28, Lindemann's group, battered and weakened by losses, was temporarily replaced by fresh units. It was announced to us that the infantry regiments would be redesignated as grenadier regiments. Perhaps the High Command wished to demonstrate that through the use of hand grenades in hand-to-hand combat, the name grenadier would show recognition of special merit or ability in battle. We did not care whether we were called grenadiers or infantrymen, because our skill in the use of grenades would not change whether we were called grenadiers or not. After a desperate battle in which the Soviet attack on Gaitolovo was repulsed, we were replaced in our positions by the 12th Air Division, and we were transferred to a quiet section of the front. In long columns, the newly baptized grenadiers set off from the log barricades along the gadas that led to the rear. It became necessary to constantly rearrange the freshly made roads and trails because they came under frequent fire from the nearby enemy when he discovered them. The soldiers walked in a walk, carrying heavy weapons on their shoulders, and sometimes they were assisted by strong Siberian horses, which we always had. The division headquarters was relocated to Poprutka, and a new sector was assigned to it around the Mordam area. There we remained in peace, recovering from the terrible ordeal at Gaitolo, until June 30, when we were again replaced by the 225th Infantry Division. At this stage of the war, we found ourselves in the Lubin, Shapki, Ushaki area, where we were able to concentrate on training our resupply. After a period of training, the division was again sent to the front line, again to a relatively quiet sector on the northwest front near the sack of Pogost. During the rest of July 1943, Regimental Commander Kinsmiller stayed with the headquarters in a small house with a blue-colored veranda. Among the tiny scattered villages of rough-hewn log houses, the painted dwelling was an exception, and the small but attractive cabin in the woods became the evening meeting place for the regiment's officers. Colonel Kinsmiller, 50 years of age, as a young lieutenant in World War I, had received a wound that left him an invalid. His left arm would not bend at the elbow. As a consequence of this injury, he used to hold this arm in a rigid posture reminiscent of the portraits of our Prussian ancestor Frederick the Great. One evening in midsummer, the commander's birthday was celebrated, and the junior officers of the regiment had prepared a surprise for him. We had agreed in advance with the soldiers' radio program, Ursula, whose broadcast we listened to every night in this sector of the front, to wish the colonel a happy birthday through it, and to dedicate a special program to him. As we gathered for an impromptu celebration, the program suddenly announced that the lieutenants of one of our grenadier regiments send their best wishes to their commander on his birthday, and on this occasion they have requested that the following song be played in his honor. After these words, the haunting melody of the popular song Der Nachtgespenst came on. At first, the commander tried to hide his surprise at this broadcast and our choice, and he typically tried to pretend that he did not like it at all. Of course, he was impressed that we had made the effort to show him such respect, but it was evident that our choice was not to his taste. He openly declared that he would have preferred the Furberliner Reitermarsch, but we were nevertheless flattered by his reaction. During the next day, enemy activity in our sector increased. Soviet aviation again became an intolerable nuisance, raiding our positions around the clock, dropping many bombs and shelling vehicles and troop concentrations with airborne weapons. At the growing rumble of the aircraft, engine soldiers instinctively rushed into trenches or sought shelter under trees. Every evening the rumble of artillery increased noticeably, and the distant sound of bursting shells carried over the treetops. One July evening, after a meeting at regimental headquarters, I noticed Colonel Kinsmiller standing alone on the edge of the blue veranda. As he gazed into the distance, to the north, whence the rumble of artillery was increasing in intensity, he noticed a chain of white rockets floating slowly on the horizon across the darkening sky. Although it was difficult to make out what he said from where I was standing, I heard him say quietly to himself that the Bohemian corporal would definitely lose his war. I did not consider this as a judgment, nor did I take it as a reflection of my commander's defeatist mood. His words simply confirmed to me what we had all begun to seriously suspect. The colonel was a fine professional officer and a good soldier. He was, as many of us at the front had to admit, an absolute realist. 4 weeks later, he was gone. A rumor reached our positions that several members of the Front Theater Brigade were at division headquarters, making a trip to entertain the soldiers. Among the theater personnel were several women. News that immediately captured all our attention. Colonel Drexel, commander of the 436th Grenadier Regiment, agreed to assume full responsibility for the safety and security of the members of the theater troupe, and in return to allow them to present their program in his regiment. The adjutant of the division, Major I.G. Geyer, was not at all anxious to let go of the ladies for whom he was responsible. Major Geyer subtly felt that in the immediate vicinity of the division headquarters were our combat units, which included 3 grenadier regiments, 1 artillery regiment, various battalions and administrative and housekeeping units, and a mass of other units required to fulfill the Army's duties. As a good staff officer, which he was, Geyer was well aware of the problems that might arise in accepting this proposal. When it became known to the junior officers that the theater troupe had already exceeded its allotted time and that Colonel Drexel's proposal had so far failed, a plan was devised and presented to Uncle Sepp Drexel for the release of the 2 ladies from the clutches of division headquarters. An assault party was sent out at night, properly equipped with spears and swords, with the usual beards, and in attractive costumes that were in keeping with the spirit of the occasion. Ahead of them all walked Uncle Sepp, and immediately behind him a horse troop of Landsnicks, who roared forward like the wild army of Woden, and Florian Geyer, fully prepared to rescue the maidens at any cost. The troop entered the enemy's lair, unfurled the parchment which proclaimed the official release of the maidens, and to applause, waving their broadswords, escorted the maidens through the forest darkness to the safety of their camp. The release of the maidens gave us a night of socializing, accompanied by drink and song, and then the ladies were returned to the division's location. The quiet sector of the front soon took on a different character. On the morning of July 22, our defenses 2.5 kilometers southwest and 3.5 kilometers northwest of the Pogosty railway station came under heavy artillery fire. After a long bombardment by Stalin's organs and mortar fire, the enemy struck hard at the area held by the Iowa Battalion of the 437th Grenadier Regiment. As shown by the interrogation of prisoners captured after this attack, the enemy planned to coordinate this attack with a major offensive on the northern front in order to encircle our troops. This was supposed to be achieved by a bypass maneuver from the east, after which the offensive would turn to the south to cut off the ledge where our main forces were located. This area was officially called Sappenkopf by the German headquarters. Despite the heavy fire of our artillery, which was conducted along the attack line, by 12.15 the enemy was able to achieve a breakthrough 250 meters wide and 400 meters deep to the west of the railway station Pogosty. This breakthrough, achieved through sheer numerical superiority, was aimed at the positions held by the 3rd Company of the 437th Grenadier Regiment. On the plots of the other 2 companies in this sector, the attack was not successful. With the help of the reserve, we managed to push back the Soviet troops on the left flank of the SAC, and by 15.35 to restore the main line of defense, by which time the enemy was forced to throw numerous killed and wounded on the battlefield. At the same time, the 3rd Company of the 437th Grenadier Regiment successfully counterattacked the enemy on the right flank. Despite the intense enemy artillery fire, with which it attempted to block the area south of the Soviet breakout zone, the remaining enemy units were forced to either withdraw or were surrounded and destroyed. The enemy had regrouped. During a lull while he prepared a new attack, the grenadiers hastily evacuated their wounded to the rear. Boxes of hand grenades were brought to the forward positions on carts. Machine gunners were filling shiny ribbons of ammunition and cleaning sand and dirt from their weapons. Someone appeared with a thermos of cold coffee and a large canvas bag full of black bread, which was swallowed in a hurry. The medics bandaged the lightly wounded before taking their weapons and returning to their platoons. The approaching explosions of mines announced the end of the temporary pause on the deadly battlefield. Again, the Soviets launched a stubborn attack on both flanks of the Sapenkov section, again aiming at Pogosht Station, and after an hour and a half of fierce fighting succeeded in breaking through the Sapenkov section at 1800 hours. Again, our thinned reserve units were thrown into a counterattack and again managed to eliminate the breakthrough for the second time within a few hours. Despite concentrated artillery fire and volleys of Stalin's organs, the 3rd Company of the 437th Grenadier Regiment by 20.45 threw back the enemy from the line of our trenches to a distance of 2 kilometers west of Pogosty Station. Thanks to this successful counterattack, the main Russian strike did not take place. The enemy plan was revealed and confirmed by interrogations of captured enemy soldiers, as well as numerous maps and supporting documents found on the battlefield. The enemy suffered relatively heavy casualties, and the regiment's report on the current situation also contained a list of enemy losses: 20 prisoners, 69 confirmed killed in our trenches, 100 confirmed killed in front of the trenches, 270 presumed killed in front of the positions, and captured ammunition and weapons: 5 heavy machine guns, 12 light machine guns, 2 pistols, 6 rifles, 63 machine guns, 2 anti-tank guns, and 3 field telephones. After repulsing the last attack before darkness enveloped the fighters, there was silence at the front. Throughout the night, muffled voices could be heard from the Soviet trenches, while meanwhile we prepared for the stern tests we would surely have to endure from dawn. As the sun rose above the treetops, the front remained suspiciously quiet. There were no reports of any enemy movements. To our relief, there was no more enemy activity until we were replaced on the front line by the 121st Infantry Division. On July 30, enemy propaganda leaflets were dropped from a Soviet Crow over the location of the 437th Infantry Regiment that read, "For us, the war is already over. Comrades, we, Field Flibble Ludwig Herbert, Oberleutnant Karl Beer, Sergeant Gustav Goals, Soldier Eugen Gieser, Soldier August Bartel, Soldier Emil Kulin from the 10th Company of the 437th Infantry Regiment were captured during the Russian attack on July 22, 1943. The officers and soldiers of the Red Army treated us politely. The wounded were immediately given medical attention. Russian soldiers even shared cigarettes with us. For us, the war is over. We no longer have to be afraid of Russian artillery. We now know that everything we were told by the battalion commander, Major Schmidt, the commander of the 9th Company, Captain Linder, the commander of the 10th Company, Lieutenant Nilka, Field Fibbles Binov, and Einlander about the cruelties and mistreatment we would experience if we fell into Russian hands was a complete lie. These ridiculous claims are disproved by the excellent treatment we have received since we became prisoners of the Soviet Union. Give my regards to our family and friends. Field Officer Ludwig Herbert, Oberleutnant Karl Beer, Sergeant Gustav Goals, Soldier Eugen Gieser, Soldier August Bartel, Soldier Emil Kulin, A100, 24.7, 40 330-000. At the end of July 1943, I was in command of the regiment's reserve group at the Moluksa position. One afternoon, I was called to the command post where I was informed that a soldier sentenced to death would be executed by a team assigned to carry out the firing squad. Having received the dreaded order to carry out the execution, I asked the battalion adjutant to bring me up to speed. If I was to be held responsible for the death of one of our own, to ease my own conscience, I wanted to know why the soldier had been sentenced to such a cruel punishment. It was explained to me that a soldier in the 5th Company had noticed another soldier stealing a box from a load of mail on his way to the platoon, from which he had taken cigarettes and groceries for himself. It was well known in our ranks that theft of this kind constituted a serious offense in the German army, for which severe punishment could follow. Then, being at the post with the culprit, the soldier who had seen the theft told the culprit that he had seen the whole thing and that he should return the stolen goods at once, otherwise the theft would be reported. The thief, evidently fearing the consequences of his crime, quickly rushed to the machine gun, turned it around on the machine and fired a line at the bystander at point-blank range. Then threw a few hand grenades, always lying ready at arm's length from the machine gun, and simulated a false battle with Russian reconnaissance, supposedly appearing in front of the trench. The wounded soldier did not die immediately. He was taken to the medical station with severe wounds in the chest and abdomen, which proved fatal. However, having regained consciousness for a while, he managed to tell the military doctor about the essence of the incident. The murderer was arrested, and a military court was urgently convened. As a result, the criminal was sentenced to death by firing squad. There was no shortage of volunteers to carry out the sentence, and a platoon from the company where the murdered man served provided the necessary number of riflemen to carry out the court's decision. The next morning I began careful preparations for the execution. From regimental headquarters I received instructions as to how it was to be carried out. Army regulations required a 2-meter pole to be erected vertically and anchored in the ground, propped up from behind. If possible, there should be a wall a short distance behind the post to catch bullets. Not far from the regimental headquarters I built a small sand berm, against which a low support wall was set up. A firing squad, accompanied by a field officer with a Luger pistol in his right hand, quietly assembled. In case the condemned man did not die at once, the field febble was to fire the fatal shot. As prescribed by the regulations, a military doctor was present. I briefed the firing squad on how the execution should take place. As I spoke to the soldiers, I looked for any sign of nervousness or hesitation in the faces of those who would have to pull the trigger. The soldiers obeyed my orders and stood silently in formation at their assigned places, rifles aside. The execution was scheduled for 15:00. A few minutes before that time, a military lawyer arrived with several ranks from the field gendarmerie. Stumbling and staggering, among them walked the condemned man, ash-faced, still dressed in his gray field uniform, but without insignia. Without hesitation, the gendarmes led the condemned man forward, where he was quickly tied to a post with his hands behind his back, tied at the wrist. Without any words, a blindfold was placed over his eyes and tied tightly at the back of his head. The convoy then moved away from the condemned man, and the division chaplain stepped forward and spoke quietly to him. A heavy silence hung in the air. The condemned man seemed to strain under the ropes with which he was tied to the post. His head fell on his chest as the chaplain whispered words inaudible to the firing squad. From the front, which was several kilometers away, the familiar bursts of shells and occasional rifle shots came to our ears. In spite of the undeniable guilt of the condemned man and the necessity of carrying out the order, we had mixed feelings as we faced the unthinkable duty of shooting one of our own, shooting at the uniform worn for so long by everyone here. Various thoughts ran through my brain. I was well aware that in another place and time this man would likely have lived a full and productive life, and that this life had been stolen from him, like millions of others, by the whims and recklessness of those outside of our power. My thoughts turned to his Samoa, his mother, his father, his relatives. I wondered if they would even know the true fate of their dear man, how he met his end in Russia. Front laws are harsh and cruel, and in this case the sentence could only be considered just. The firing squad remained opposite the bound soldier. I looked around at those present and noticed that all the witnesses and participants in what was happening had their eyes fixed on the man who was destined to die. The people in the firing squad had grim, tired faces, devoid of any emotion. The lawyer and the medic stood distant, probably out of the line of fire, hands clasped behind their backs, wiping all expression from their faces. Only the paramedic with his pistol in his hand looked at me expectantly. I noticed that I was looking at my watch. At exactly 3 p.m., as on the parade ground, the command came out of my throat. Rifles at the ready. Aim in volleys. Fire. With a rumble of bullets tore through the convict's chest, he was thrown back against the pillar, blood spurting from his wounds. He collapsed, hanging from the ropes as consciousness left him, and for several seconds he hung on the pole. A doctor came up to examine the motionless body. Despite the severity of the wounds, he detected a pulse and looked first at me, then shifted his gaze to the Feldfebel, signaling him to come closer. The Feldfebel stepped forward, raised his arm, and fired at point-blank range into the convict's head, just behind the ear. The medic came up again, examined the now lifeless body, and called for the gendarme escort. 2 men untied the body from the pole. More men came over and placed the body in a wooden box. Without a word, they disappeared in a cloud of dust that rose after them on the road. In putting this unforgettable memory into words, I must also state that this incident was the only one in all my years on the Eastern Front. Never again did I even remotely hear of such an incident of theft among the frontline soldiers. In August 1943, our division replaced the 121st Infantry Division, which had suffered heavy losses in the battles on the Neva River on a front 10 kilometers long. On August 2, the 436th Grenadier Regiment came under the command of the 5th Mountain Rifle Division, which had to withstand numerous enemy attacks, reinforced by a large number of tanks, and which lost many of its soldiers. The days preceding the 132nd Division's arrival at the front were relatively quiet. However, on August 11, the enemy launched a major offensive. Attacking the Porky bridgehead with forces of up to 1 regiment, the Soviets managed to break through the weak defenses, but were then driven back by our counterattack with heavy losses to themselves. A second attack launched in the evening was again repulsed with the support of our heavy artillery. During the night, the troops were preparing to continue the battle. Trying to establish supplies for the exhausted units, the frontline soldiers were constantly bombarded by Soviet air raids. Although it was impossible to see the rats in the darkness, their humming rapidly increased. Then they made a U-turn and swept over our positions, dropping many bombs and showering the ground with bursts from their machine guns. On August 12, at 9:00 a.m., the enemy began an attack along the whole front with his entire fighting strength. His forces consisted of numerous chains of infantry dressed in brown uniforms, strongly supported by artillery, tanks, and considerable air support. These attacks by forces up to company, battalion, and regimental strength, which lasted all day, were repulsed either by brutal hand-to-hand combat or by a combination of all available firepower. A assembled reserve group was responsible for the elimination of individual breakthroughs. In the sector held by the 437th Infantry Regiment, the enemy succeeded in breaking through the forward trench and was able to extend the captured breakthrough area southward with a total length of 300 meters. The reserve counterattack was rendered futile by the massive fire support given to the enemy by artillery and tanks. During that night, 19 enemy tanks were destroyed in close combat. Feldfebel Rehn of the 7th Company of the 436th Grenadier Regiment distinguished himself by personally destroying 2 enemy tanks and then taking command of the company after the commander was seriously wounded. Leading the company into battle against a superior enemy force, he repulsed Soviet attempts to break through the defense line and drive a wedge between the 2 regiments. His courage and skill were invaluable in preventing the regiments from being surrounded and possibly destroyed. On August 13 at 4:30, the Russians again struck our defenses, and after initial success, when they were able to push back the German defenders, were unable to break further through the front held by the surviving grenadiers. At 6:00, we counterattacked the superior enemy, supported by heavy artillery, but were only able to push the enemy back slightly. When our attack was exhausted, the enemy struck with renewed vigor and broke through our defenses with the help of tanks with simultaneous support from heavy artillery. While the battlefield moved back and forth through forests and swamps, the Soviets managed to break through to the south and occupy the area northeast of Porky. Again, our regiment was thrown into the fight. In a brutal, all-day battle, We finally managed to stop the Soviet advance at 17.00 and retook the Porky sector. After suffering numerous casualties, the Russians halted at the crest of a hill marked as Hill 54.1, which is about 200 meters from Lake Barsky. This effort required us to expend the last of our manpower and material reserves and ended in success only after heavy fighting that dragged on into the evening. The next day, the I Battalion of the 1st Grenadier Regiment, the 132nd Reconnaissance Battalion, the 132nd Engineer Battalion, and parts of the IOA Battalion of the 437th Grenadier Regiment were withdrawn from the forward positions. Immediately reformed into Schmidt's battle group, they were thrown into action to restore the situation in the area referred to in battle reports as Sandkal. Despite the dense barrage of Soviet batteries, the attack was a success, and the units advancing on the left and right flanks soon accomplished their objectives. The Russians counterattacked with air, artillery, and tank support. Despite the initial success, due to the overwhelming superiority of the advance, it became necessary to pull back Schmidt's battle group, thus leaving the Sandkal Heights to the enemy. In the afternoon, the enemy responded to the withdrawal of Schmidt's group with a new attack. Although our group fought all day, it was able to repel the enemy attack and drive back the Soviet troops. During the battle, the group was almost continuously attacked by enemy attack aircraft, which dropped fragmentation bombs and shelled the attacking grenadiers with airborne weapons. By evening, the main line of defense was still in our hands, although the Soviets paid dearly for their attempts to break through and encircle our units. The enemy took advantage of the night to reform their forces. There was noise from their position in the forest, the howling of Ford engines, accompanied by the rumbling of T-34 tanks moving forward through the Soviet positions. Ammunition was brought to the positions. The soldiers began to bandage the wounded, and especially heavy ones, to ferry to the rear, and themselves waited for what, as their instincts told them, the next day would bring. In the early morning hours, silence fell upon the vast expanse of forest. Exhausted soldiers lay behind makeshift barricades and huddled in hastily dug rifle cells, trying to sleep. In the gray dawn rays, snipers crawled forward and began studying the ghostly landscape through the optics of their rifles, looking for any hint of movement. With their experienced eyes fixed on the rubber ring protecting the optics, they slowly surveyed their sector of fire from left to right and right to left, following the grid that had settled in their brains, leaving no branch, splintered tree, or overturned piece untouched. That morning, the sniper rifles remained silent. No enemy reconnaissance teams dared to move forward, no sentries were posted, and not a single Soviet sniper responded and did not engage ours in a deadly duel. The silence that descended on the front was an ambiguous, perhaps ominous, signal to our troops frozen in anticipation behind the barricades. The Russians in their positions were not entrenched. The sun had risen above the treetops when, at 9 o'clock, the Air Force descended on our positions. Bombs burst in the middle of the trenches, followed by the sharp bursts of mines exploding on pre-selected targets. The soldiers crawled away to hide in the depths of their barricades, pressed themselves to the ground, and waited for the artillery raid to stop. After long minutes, the explosions fell silent and the attack began. Gray-green figures sprang from their rifle cells, holding machine guns and rifles, inserted fuses, piled their stockpiles of hand grenades, and met the attack. In thick rows, the Soviet infantry broke through the poorly defended line of trenches in two sectors. Seeking an encompassing maneuver, they struck in the direction of Schlossberg, Barakin, and the Jewish cemetery. Despite artillery fire and assault raids, the grenadiers were able to halt this advance. The 2nd Company of the 437th Grenadier Regiment distinguished itself in repelling this attack by the enemy, who had broken through in the Nasha sector west of Geisterwalchen and were attempting to strike southward. Nevertheless, we realized that it was now necessary to withdraw our troops from the Sandkal Heights. On the night of August 14 to 15, the grenadiers were withdrawn and hastily reinforced with a reserve battalion. After this maneuver, It became obvious that the Porichi bridgehead had to be evacuated to avoid encirclement of the troops still holding their positions in this area. During the night of August 15 to 16, the withdrawal began, and the positions, except for a 100-meter stretch east of Nesha, were abandoned. After this withdrawal to an area better suited for defense, the threat of a breakthrough was temporarily eliminated, even though we surrendered some territory. In the sector held by the division, the main position remained intact, and numerous attempts by the Soviets to break through the defenses were unsuccessful. During the withdrawal of the 132nd Infantry Division from the front line, the 1st Infantry Division replaced the badly battered 437th Grenadier Regiment in the early morning hours of August 16. That evening, the 132nd Infantry Division began withdrawing from its positions and was officially replaced by the 254th Infantry Division. Thinned in numbers and exhausted beyond belief, the Grenadiers successfully defended the front for nearly 7 days and nights of continuous fighting against a vastly superior enemy. After this final retreat, the 132nd Infantry Division's role in the defense of the Porik bridgehead came to an end. During this battle, the enemy put the following divisions and tank units into action: 364th Infantry Division, with 3 regiments; 374th Infantry Division, with 2 regiments; 165th Infantry Division, with 2 regiments; 378th Infantry Division, with 2 regiments; 311th Infantry Division, plus 1 regiment; 256th Infantry Division, plus 1 regiment; 503rd Tank Battalion with 14 tanks; 35th Tank Regiment with 15 tanks; 50th Tank Regiment with 15 tanks; 77th Special Engineer Battalion, according to our data, suffered heavy losses from 12 to 15 enemy battalions, destroyed 24 tanks, 10 of which were hit in close combat. During the furious Soviet attempts to break through the defense line, the enemy suffered extremely heavy losses. After the withdrawal of our division, the battle south of Lake Ladoga came to an end.